Bad Ideas, the show where we look at misfires, mistakes, and miscalculations from all throughout history.
I'm Tony Southcott.
And I am Albert Berg. And the bad idea that we have for today is a type of gun. We are going to be talking about a rocket gun, which is not a new idea by any stretch of the imagination. The specific rocket gun we're going to be talking about is relatively recent. It's from the 1960s, but all the way back in the early 1800s, the Royal Danish Army Arsenal had the Voss Musket Rocket, and it was essentially a rocket round that was designed to be launched from a regular standard issue musket. So guns back in the day were pretty simple. You had a flintlock type thing. You ignited gunpowder with, like a match or something that was burning. And the idea here was, okay, instead of exploding some gunpowder, we're going to drop this lit wick onto the back of a rocket and fire this rocket out of the front of the musket. And there's an important difference between a regular gun and a rocket gun that we're going to be discussing today. Tony, you know a little bit about regular guns. You have some within arm's reach of you. Describe to the people the basic operation of a gun and how that your gun that almost everybody would be familiar with from movies and TV and stuff like that, how that operates.
Well, essentially, you're going to have something strike a primer on the back of a bullet that's going to ignite the gunpowder inside the shell casing, and it's going to fire the actual bullet forward.
Right, and specifically, the gunpowder explodes and expands through the barrel, pushing the bullet in front of it. Once the bullet is out of the barrel, it's done accelerating. It's as fast as it's ever going to go, and air resistance slows it down from there, but it gets pushed really, really fast from within the gun barrel. A rocket gun, on the other hand, starts accelerating in the barrel and flies out of the barrel and continues pushing itself through the air. And these were initially used as signaling devices and still are. In fact, you can buy flare guns today that are essentially rocket guns, and they're of the same type. The technology has not changed that much from when the Danish Army Arsenal was developing them back in the 1800s. And you'll notice that the flare guns that you can buy are made with plastic barrels because there's not a lot of pressure generated in the barrel of the gun.
Whereas with a normal pistol, it's all pressure that's actually going to be forcing it forward along with the internal explosion.
Now, moving on forward with the history of rocket guns, we got a little bit more of an update with the Walther Rocket Gun. It was developed in Germany during World War II, and this was kind of close to the end of the war. They were desperate for something that would help them pull out of their sort of death spiral that they were in. There's a lot of weird tech that Germany came up with at the time, but the appeal of this was that, again, as we mentioned, the strength of the barrel did not have to be so great, so you could make the guns themselves really, really cheaply because there wasn't any danger of them exploding from the pressure of the expanding gas.
On a side note with the Walther company, the Walther PPK is usually what James Bond is using. So it's still a fairly modern and good gun company that is still around.
Yep, lots of we'll say good stuff came out of Germany from that time. We stole a lot of their tech. James Bond is also going to come up a little bit later in this episode, Tony.
Nice.
You mentioned that they're still around, and the tech is still around from the World War II because something that happened. They didn't ever fully get into production with this Walther rocket gun. There are drawings, there may be a couple of models, but really it never got very far off the ground. But when the Allies came over, they took a bunch of their tech and they tried it out. There was a lot of experimentation with rockets, and Wernher von Braun came over and of course helped out our space program. But they took a look at these really tiny rockets as well and did some testing on them. They found that they were inaccurate and unreliable. And that brings us to two gentlemen, Robert Mainhardt and Art Biehl. And these two guys, at least one of them is rumored to have worked with Wernher von Braun himself, which is an interesting connection. I looked for personal information about these two guys, Tony. I really wanted to find out about what their life was like and who they were and how they came to be here. And there's not a lot around. There's a lot written about the gun that they developed. But what I was able to find is that these two guys seem to have worked as nuclear scientists together at various labs. They have some papers that they published that weren't relevant to this exact topic, but they worked together before they went into this venture. And Robert Mainhardt won $100,000 for designing a nuclear reactor that could fit on the back of an 18-wheeler truck, which was a pretty significant accomplishment of the time.
It sounds like it would still be a pretty significant accomplishment right now.
Well, and you can imagine this is the nuclear age too, so hauling around nuclear stuff would be pretty cool if you could have something that could just pull up in your backyard and provide power for a whole city. That might be pretty legit. I haven't actually heard of that design being implemented.
Well, right now you've got people like Taylor Wilson trying to create something like that, something that would be about the size of a small house that could power an entire city through thorium reaction or pebble bed reactions. So there's ideas of this technology, but we're not near at the point where just pulling up an 18-wheeler with that would be sufficient and safe.
And this is happening back in the 1960s or even 1950s when he, I think, first wins his contest. So $100,000 was a legit amount of money. It still is, but it really was back then. And I don't have specifics on this, but somewhere in this process, his associate Art Biehl, that they've been working together on nuclear science stuff, has gotten the idea into his head that they can make a rocket gun. And their initial idea was actually to produce just a different type of flare gun, essentially. And they were going to sell them to the military, but they were approached by government personnel to develop their product as a weapon rather than just a flare gun. And so they get this bug. I don't know exactly where it comes from, but at some point, these guys really latch onto the idea of making an anti-personnel rocket gun. They start off in 1960 with the goal to experiment and produce economical rocket ammunition less than 1 inch in diameter. That's way big for what a regular ammunition would look like, but for a rocket, that's pretty small.
Yeah, and you've seen in modern guns where they have like a grenade launcher type barrel underneath everything that's bigger than 1 inch. So eventually that sort of design would become kind of standard for high-grade military weapons.
Now, the difficulty that they faced was in accuracy. All of these rocket guns throughout history, from all of the research that I did, the Germans ran into this, the testing that the US government did ran into this, and the issue that these two guys set out to solve was in accuracy. Because when you fire a bullet, you have these very precise rifled grooves, Tony. And I looked up some videos on how they do this today, and it's incredible the amount of engineering that goes into a single gun barrel. It's got to be strong, it's got to be precise, it's got to be an exact width. These grooves have to be really perfectly machined. And what those grooves do is they create spin on the bullet, and the spin of the bullet, along with its speed, gives it its accuracy. It's like a gyroscope. It doesn't tumble in the air as it would if it was just coming out smooth. And they had to find a way to do this with their rockets. So their idea was to produce thrust in such a way that it would make the rocket spin in the air. So their rockets were a little bit angled as they came out the back. They pushed the rocket forward, but they also made it spin, and they named their concept the Gyrojet Rocket Gun.
I mean, what could go wrong?
Well, I'll tell you what could go wrong, Tony. It turns out that despite their really smart idea of making it spin, it still wasn't super accurate. And this is something that the Gyrojet would never be able to shake. Their initial tests, if they fired from a distance of 50 yards, the Gyrojet had a spread of over 70 inches. 50 yards from like a combat standpoint is not super far away, and 70 inches is a lot of number of inches. I'm 70 inches tall. So plus a little bit, but it's
yeah, you're like 76 inches tall or something like that. But still.
I'm reading here. I don't want to have to do math today, Tony. Point being, this is terrible. Like handguns, by comparison, like a 45 caliber handgun will group at about 2 inches at the same distance on a target.
Yeah, I was curious what it would be at 50 yards because it is a little bit harder at that point with a pistol, whereas with an M16 you would probably have like less than an inch if you were actually competent with the weapon.
Well, we're talking about lockdown as well. A pistol obviously doesn't have the same stabilization in the hand, so the pistol is a little bit different, but still, these guys are wildly inaccurate. The mechanism, though, to make this happen, I thought was really interesting because you described the action of a normal firearm earlier, how that there is a hammer that strikes a primer. The explosion of gases will actually push that hammer back into place and fire the gun forward. So you use a little bit of the power to propel the bullet to get the hammer to go back into place if you have a semi-automatic or an automatic weapon and get it ready for the next round. With the Gyrojet, because you're using a jet, the force backwards onto a hammer would not be anywhere near sufficient to cock it backwards. So they actually used a hammer that struck the front of the bullet, banged it back onto a firing pin. The firing pin would set off the rocket, and then the rocket itself would push forward into the hammer and knock it down back into firing position as it moved forward into the barrel.
I don't know why you would need to make this semi-automatic. If you're firing rockets, it seems like it would be better just to have the firing pin work from behind and reset it manually. That just seems like that could have been a huge part of why they had inaccuracy issues.
That's possible. I think that they were wanting to compete with regular rounds, though. I mean, this did have advantages because when it got to top speed, it could do much more damage than a regular bullet could because it was accelerating all the way. Whereas a standard bullet, again, as soon as it hits the air, starts to decelerate. The Gyrojet was essentially an armor-piercing round because when it got to full speed, it was incredibly deadly. In fact, it sounded weird. I haven't got to watch any of the videos of this in action, but from what I've read, it doesn't pop like a gun. Again, you have that explosion with the gun, you have expanding gases, and that's all, happening just in the fraction of an instant. With the Gyrojet, you have a whoosh of this rocket, and then after it's out of the gun for several seconds, it has a sonic boom because it gets going past the speed of sound, which sounds incredibly weird. If you were actually firing this thing, it would just be completely odd.
Yeah, where like you hear the sonic boom whenever it's almost reached its target.
Yes, and that leads into another problem that the gun had, because the nature of the way this thing accelerated led to a lot of problems. As we mentioned, when it was going at top speed, when the rocket had got it up to speed, it was great, right? However, it took time to get to that top speed, and at close range, it was incredibly slow, to the point where if you just put your hand over the barrel of the gun, you could stop the rocket from coming out without damaging your hand.
And then you just have a live rocket sitting in the barrel.
I mean, it would be hot, right? Like, it would be spinning around. And I wouldn't recommend that, Tony. But it was, like you put a piece of tape over the front of this gun and it's not going to work because it takes time to get up to speed. Whereas, again, a normal bullet is going at top speed the second it leaves the gun. So it's kind of ineffective for combat in a bunch of different ways. And because of this, Art Biehl and Robert Mainhardt are not able to sell this idea to the military directly.
Also, as a side note, I want to tell people that I expected this to be a very bulky looking gun, like just something that was giant and unwieldy. It looks like a straight up normal pistol. Like everything about this is just like this is something you would have holstered on your hip. Like if it were to work, it looks like it would be an awesome weapon, but it just did not pan out.
Well, it doesn't. The great thing about it was it didn't need to be bulky. The fact that they were able to not have all this pressure in the barrel meant that not only did they not need to have a lot of bulk, in fact, they had to drill holes in the sides of the barrel for exhaust to come out, but they could also use really cheap steel. Like they used the grade of steel that they make Hot Wheels cars out of to make this car. It was able to be produced that cheaply, which was the big draw of the Gyrojet. And again, I wish I knew more about Art Biehl and Robert Mainhardt, but they weren't deterred completely by their failure with the military because they tried to go a different route. They're self-promoting here, They go for this program called Rocket Guns for Rice Farmers.
What?
And yes, this is during the height of the Vietnam War. And MB Associates tries to release the Gyrojet as a guerrilla weapon in Vietnam, where they're going to give these guns to the people of Vietnam to fight off the Viet Cong and hopefully help win the war. They give like a gold-plated model to the Vietnamese president. His underlings got all silver-plated models, and they were supposed to, after they get this seed planted, pass these guns on down to these rice farmers. Unfortunately, the rice farmers didn't want to fight in the war. There's a quote here. They said, "Why should we shoot the Viet Cong? They only come to get their tax ration of rice. We know we will either have to give them some rice or give some to Saigon, so who cares?" So the rocket gun did not take off in Vietnam. They've got one more chance, Tony. They can't sell it to the military. They can't get it going as a sort of guerrilla weapon in Vietnam, but they can still sell these things. And they have a leg up here a little bit because these are weird looking guns. They look completely unique to any other gun that's out there. I mean, it still has the same basic form factor, right? But they're able to design it in a way that looks unlike most other firearms at the time.
Yeah, it's basically got I wouldn't say corrugated, but like imagine that the top part of the pistol, the slide, has a bunch of just holes drilled into it, probably to help deal with heat. I don't know if it's actually venting gases out of the sides.
It does vent gas, yes.
Okay,
it actually helps the rocket somehow.
Yeah.
I'm not a rocket scientist, Tony. These guys were. But they try to sell it as a commercial product, and it gets into stores. It sells, despite the fact that the gun is made really cheaply, because it's so weird looking, they're able to sell it at a relatively high price. And they get a little bit of a bonus because in 1967, James Bond appears in You Only Live Twice with one of these guns. Now, at this point, things almost went right for the Gyrojet Rocket Gun Company, Tony. MBA would have maybe been able to make it, but the government got in the way.
It's always the government getting in the way of these bullets.
The Gun Control Act of 1968 specifically laid out any weapon that had a larger caliber than .50 caliber as its ammunition. Now, it was not a gun ban, it was a destructive device ban. These were not initially labeled as guns according to the ATF because they fired rockets, but this wider ban caught them, and their caliber ammunition was 51. They had 51 caliber ammo. This thing cuts off at 50, and that essentially was sort of the end of the beginning of the end for MBA.
So like that 1/100th of an inch or whatever was enough to make it so that it was just illegal in the US.
Yes. They tried after that to market a .49 caliber version of the gun. They toned it down, but by that time the damage was done. And it's a really honestly disappointing story. You can tell that Robert Mainhardt especially really loved this gun, because even after his company went out of business, and I could not find the specifics of what the end of days was like for MBA, he sent a copy of the gun to President Reagan and would send him like an annual allotment of shells to shoot off, which these shells were incredibly expensive. And for a long time at this company were being made by hand. He loved this gun. The gun also actually appears in a 1989 movie starring Jay Leno called The Collision Course, but that was just sort of a novelty by that time, just sort of a weird plot point for them to have as a murder weapon. The Gyrojet was dead, and probably deserved to be so, because I think the Gyrojet was a bad idea because it solved a problem that didn't really need to be solved, Tony.
I mean, you already have powerful ammunition, and whenever you need a rocket, you've got RPGs and you've got various other things. So it was kind of changing. It was a different take on armor-piercing rounds. It was something that you could actually put into a pistol, so that's kind of a cool and novel concept. But if you're trying to pierce armor, you got to have more accuracy than that. Like, I see that they made a Gyro Jet Carbine, which is like a full-size rifle, and I wonder if that actually took care of some of the accuracy issues.
I know they were working on the accuracy throughout the life of the gun, but the problem I think that they were trying to solve was this idea of making a cheaper to produce gun, which, you can see the appeal of that, right? Producing a gun barrel is a relatively sophisticated feat of engineering and science, and it takes a lot of, really specific metallurgy. It has to stand up to a lot of pressure, and they did solve that problem with this gun. The problem is that the ammo then became exponentially more difficult to produce. These rockets had to be very specifically machined and, work on the same way every single time. And I think that, even if they had gotten their rocket guns for rice farmers initiative off the ground, there's no way that these rice farmers were going to be able to afford the ammo to put in their cheap guns that they got from Americans.
Yeah, even if they were being supplemented by the American Army and everything, that's still a huge expense for us to be putting a bunch of weapons into the hands of untrained people that could have also been Viet Cong.
Yes, it seems like the value there was not super great. I did also find it interesting. Again, I was interested in these guys personally. I did not find very much on them. But Robert Mainhardt, after being involved with the Gyro Jet Rocket Gun and the NBA, and after all that dissolved, he goes on to work for the Milco Company, which was some kind of a scientific research firm. He was president of it for a while and owned stock. And he resigned after being asked to steal secrets that could be used to make a nuclear weapon. And later on, some of the executives of that particular company were tried for espionage and selling state secrets. So Mainhardt lived a really weird and interesting life.
Who was he trying to steal it for, or who were they trying to get it for?
I think they were trying to get it for themselves, possibly to sell to other people.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Let's just let some random company get nuclear secrets so that they can sell to the highest bidder.
Well, he quit in protest, and I don't know. He seems to have done okay for himself. He still owned stocks in this company. I'd never found out really what happened to the other half of this venture, Art Biehl, but these guys had their idea, it flopped, and it's just another one of the many flops on the dustbin of history, Tony.
Is there anything else about this gun you'd like to talk about before we end the episode?
No, I don't think so, but I do want to end every episode by reminding people that these were not dumb guys. And good ideas can look like bad ideas, and bad ideas can seem like good ideas. And sometimes the only way to tell the difference is to try. And if people weren't trying, we wouldn't have this interesting stuff to talk about. You got to fail forward. And that's what we're all about here at the Bad Ideas Podcast.
Thank you guys for listening to this first episode of the Bad Ideas Podcast. We will be seeing you once every 2 weeks with a new bad idea.
And don't forget, if you have bad ideas that you think we should talk about, again, things that hopefully there are a reasonable amount of information about that we can dig into with history and specifics, send them on over. Not giant things. The Holocaust was a bad idea. A little bit wider in scope than we're trying to go.
Yeah, go granular. Think about like the weirdest, worst things that you've ever seen somebody do.
Also, maybe not current bad ideas. Like, don't send in electing Donald Trump.
And if you guys do have ideas for the show, send them to badideasshow@gmail.com or @human echoes on Twitter.
Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.
Bye, everybody.